So I think the big thing for me has been accepting that I am not going to be good at everything. And as I say, coming from a very academic background where you kind of had to be good at everything, or you had to step away yourself, that was a real challenge. And I these days walk into any kind of environment like that, especially when it comes to new sports or new travel opportunities or new friendship groups, with a viewpoint of anything that I gain at this point is going to be a step forward from where I am now. Even if that means I go along, and I did this with a ballet fitness class, which is the least likely thing I would ever do. And I hated every second of it. Genuinely did not enjoy a moment. But being able to go there and go, all right, well, I'm not going to go back, but I've learnt something. I have learnt that this is not my thing. I have learnt that I'm more flexible than I thought I was. There were things that were able to be taken out of that experience, even if the experience itself didn't lead to great things on paper.
Katy, welcome to Aerobility. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. So I'm really excited to hear your story today. So you're a first officer on the 737. You're also a squadron leader in the RAF Air Cadets. You are the Chair of Trustees for a new charity, Aviation in Reach, which I'm really excited to talk about. And also, you received an MBE in 2022. So many congratulations for that.
Thank you. Bit of a surprise, that one.
Well, really exciting to hear your story. So first of all, though, let's go back to the very beginning and hear about Katy and who Katy was growing up.
Sure. So I grew up in an aviation family. My dad was a pilot, my mum was cabin crew. Nothing like a stereotype. And, we used to do a lot of travelling. I was used to family being away at weird times, getting up at weird times, coming home at weird times. Everything was quite kind of fluid and flexible. My mum stopped flying when I was quite young, but my dad flew sort of all through my childhood. And it was a lovely childhood. We had a lovely house. We were surrounded by other people who all flew, and we got great holidays. And yeah, it was all very nice and stable. My dad died when I was 9, which was obviously a bit of a surprise, and that kind of changed the dynamic of a lot of things. But up until that point, absolutely idyllic, which was really lovely.
And brothers, sisters?
No, just me.
And whereabouts did you live growing up?
So West Berkshire, along with an awful lot of other BA children, I think, at the time.
So being surrounded by aviation, was that what you aspired to go into growing up, or did you think about any other career choices?
So I think, like a lot of children, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. When I was very, very young, like young primary school, I toyed with being a vet, but then I realised I wasn't actually that keen on animals, not enough to spend 24/7 with them. When I got to secondary school and there was this kind of push for, well, what do you want to do? I had no idea. So I probably didn't even decide I wanted to be a pilot until I was about 15, 16. Up until that point, I was kind of coasting through. I figured something would come up that would grab me at some point, and it did, but it took quite a long time.
And what about subjects at school? What were your favourite subjects?
Maths, languages. I was fairly academic as a child, so anything that didn't involve anything artsy, I wasn't particularly sporty. But I loved maths when I was little, and that kind of went through. I ended up doing maths, economics, French and Spanish at A-level. So yeah, that kind of persisted.
And then did you go on to university, or then did you go straight into your
No, not at all.
After that?
I was offered a place to read economics and Spanish at the University of Glasgow, and was really excited about that because at least I had some kind of a plan, some kind of a path to go down. I was at a very, very academic school, and everybody went to university, apart from me and my best friend at school. I believe we slightly let down our headmistress at the time because she had words with us about the fact that we were ruining the 100% off to uni rate, because my best mate went to violin school, so she's now a luthier in Switzerland, which is quite cool, and I went to flying school. But it was, I wouldn't necessarily say a late decision, it was more a case of I didn't want to kind of pin my hopes on flying school because I had university as a backup. So yeah, straight to flying school when I left school.
What about role models? Was there anyone who was a role model that you looked up to growing up, or maybe even just the main influences that you had on your life?
So I don't necessarily think I had a specific role model as such, certainly not from an aviation perspective, not until quite late on. My mum was always very, very good. Her tagline was always, right, you can do whatever you want to be apart from be the Pope, which was fine because I'm not religious and we certainly weren't Catholic. But she supported me in anything I wanted to do, which was really lovely. And then when I started learning to fly at the age of about 15 up at Wickham Air Park, the first instructor I had was very, very gentle, very sweet. She left quite quickly because she now flies for Loganair. And I got a chap who's now one of my best friends. And he was 21, quite loud, quite brash. Apparently they had to have a bit of a talking to with him just to say, right, you've got to be really gentle with her because she's just quite fragile. That wasn't necessarily the case. But he was, again, very, very good at the whole confidence building thing because you were never allowed any excuses. It was very much a case of, right, just crack on and do it. And one day he said to me when we were flying, quite early on to my PPL, he said, right, are you going to do this as a job then? And all of a sudden I went, oh, maybe I should. And it was ridiculous. I've grown up in a world where people are pilots. The majority of people we knew were pilots. And I'd never really considered it up until that point.
Why do you think that was, out of interest?
I think because I'd never considered it anything particularly special, which was probably a factor. But because I'd never really spent that much time thinking about what I wanted to do, because there were so many diverse little things that I enjoyed. I toyed with the idea of being a doctor. I'd thought about maybe going into international development and going working abroad, using my language skills, maybe becoming an economist. And it was only when he said that suddenly I went, actually, this is probably the easiest way to fit together everything that I'm interested in and, help develop a passion that is now growing.
In terms of, I'm just thinking about your decision or not considering it as an option. Do you think did you know many female pilots at the time?
We knew quite a few, actually, yeah.
You did, because I'm wondering whether you hadn't seen many, because I know something for me, I didn't think about it as a career option because I hadn't seen many female pilots. I didn't consciously assume that it was something that women couldn't do, but I just didn't know many women who did it. So I was just wondering if that was a factor in your decision.
I don't think so in this case. Having gone to an all-girls school, think what you like about the whole gender segregated education, but actually for me that did mean that there were no real barriers to what you could or couldn't do, which was really nice. I think I'd really considered that university was the way forward because, as I say, that's what everyone at the school did. It was so highly academic that you go to university, it's just which university and which course. So we'd never really discussed other options because they weren't particularly keen on other options at the time. The school itself has changed massively and is in fantastic hands these days, and it's a much healthier environment. But I think that was probably why, because it wasn't, to my mind, in the environment I grew up in, kind of academic enough.
So the school being very academic then, were there any times when you failed at something? Because it sounds like there was obviously quite a lot of pressure to meet a certain standard.
So yes and no. Academically, not really, because I was quite keen on the academic side of things. But as I say, I was never very sporty, and I think a lot of that was because I was written off quite early as not being like, I'm not massively tall and fast and leggy and whatever. So I didn't fit into the kind of their model of what a sportswoman looked like. So I didn't really get involved in sports because fundamentally I was terrible at lacrosse. The thought of having a cricket ball sized thing thrown at your head still fills me with absolute fear. And being thrown on the lacrosse pitch at sort of 11, 12 years old, I used to duck.
It's brutal. We played lacrosse at my school and it is a brutal game.
It's terrifying. It is. Absolutely terrifying. Not my thing. So I think that was probably where I didn't necessarily fail, but I stepped away from something because I felt like I had been written off in that regard. And it feels like such a pity now because I found sport when I left school and do a huge amount now. But there's so much time, there was so much potential there where I could have done an awful lot more and I think enjoyed it an awful lot more had that not been a kind of a line in the sand side of things.
It's interesting because when I first heard you say that you weren't good at sport at school, my first thought was, I'm sure you're quite sporty now. Mm. And I could sort of relate to that a bit myself as well with school and, not being great at sport, being written off. But do you think sometimes we're encouraged to do what we're good at and then not do what we're not good at, and that part of having this sort of growth mindset is to go, okay, well, I wasn't good at that, but I'm going to find ways to be good at it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it all comes down to really whether or not you enjoy the process. So I was terrible at art, but I also hated it. So even now, I cannot sit down and draw things because I'm no good and I find it really dull. And that was a kind of a case of, yes, I was probably written off a little bit as an artist, but I didn't care because I wasn't getting anything out of it. Going back to that kind of growth mindset side of things, looking at sport or the things where you're getting something out of it, even if you're not necessarily achieving well to start with. Sport is sort of somewhere, or an environment where there are so many different aspects that actually everyone's going to find something that they enjoy within it. And like recently, this weekend, I had a kickboxing session. First ever trial kickboxing session. Of course I was no good at it. I've never done it before. Slightly disconcerting to be surrounded by a lot of 7 and 8-year-olds who were obviously quite good because they have no fear and they've been practicing for a while. And I'm going, oh, you're very small, you're very competent. I feel slightly inadequate here. But it was really nice to be able to walk into that sort of environment and go, no, of course I'm going to be rubbish at this because I don't know what's going on. But let's persist and give it a go and see how it goes. And it was great fun. And if that opportunity had been available a little bit more when I was at school with the sports side of things, I think it would have made a genuine difference to how I perceived my own abilities, but also myself. Teenage girls' self-image at that point is never great. And being able to say, okay, so I can write an essay on Keynesian economics, I can speak in Spanish, but I can also go and run a half marathon or play a really good game of basketball or do really well on the wing at rugby or whatever it would happen to be, would have just given me, I think, a bit more confidence at that age, because it is something you're really lacking, I found.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that, actually, that it's hard to push yourself out of your comfort zone because, you're good at economics, you're good at Spanish, but sports is something that it's not something that you would naturally good at, but then with the right coaching and encouragement and actually being comfortable to go, like with kickboxing, to go, I'm not good at this, but of course I'm not going to be to start with. It's a good starting point.
Oh, absolutely.
But I will get good at it if I practice. So in terms of, it sounds like what you did was you really pushed yourself out of your comfort zone and then got involved in sports, and sport brings, huge benefits for physical and mental health. So what advice would you give to any of our viewers and listeners then with regards to pushing themselves out of their comfort zone and just overcoming, taking that first step to then have this journey in sport that you've now had?
So I think the big thing for me has been accepting that I am not going to be good at everything. And as I say, coming from a very academic background where you kind of had to be good at everything, or you had to step away yourself, that was a real challenge. And I these days walk into any kind of environment like that, especially when it comes to new sports or new travel opportunities or new friendship groups, with a viewpoint of anything that I gain at this point is going to be a step forward from where I am now. Even if that means I go along, and I did this with a ballet fitness class. My mother convinced me to go to a ballet fitness class a few years back, which is the least likely thing I would ever do. And I hated every second of it. Genuinely did not enjoy a moment. But being able to go there and go, all right, well, I'm not going to go back, but I've learnt something. I have learnt that this is not my thing. I have learnt that this is what this kind of dance fitness class looks like. I've learnt that I'm more flexible than I thought I was. There were things that were able to be taken out of that experience, even if the experience itself didn't lead to great things on paper.
Yeah, that's a really valuable key message. I think what you're saying, just give it a go and just finding that self-confidence to just try something and accept that you're not going to be the best at everything you do, but that's okay.
Oh, 100%. I found with some things, if they're a bit too intimidating, taking a friend who also knows nothing is quite nice.
That's good.
Because then you 100% know you're not going to be the only person who feels like a fish out of water when you step into the room.
So talking about your flying training then, how did you find that?
It was really interesting. It was really enjoyable, mostly. Certainly the PPL side of things, loved it. I got to fly with a good friend of mine, as I say, who was my instructor at the time. He now flies for TUI as well, actually. And it was fantastic because we would put the world to rights. He would show me so many different, not just aviation skills, but also we had discussions that were just opening my mind to the world a bit. Being at an all-girls school, actually being able to speak to somebody who'd had a completely different life experience was really valuable. Flying school itself, when I left secondary school to go full-time, was intense. It was, as they say, sort of a bit like doing a degree in 6 months in terms of the theory side of things, and it was a lot. But actually having that academic background made it quite straightforward. Studying constantly was not a massive drama because there was a light at the end of the tunnel. You knew when the defined finish point was. I think the challenge for me was probably going away to fly in America, because we went out there for 5-6 months. And moving away at 18 from all of your family and all of your friends to go and study intensively in another country it's quite a big step. It is quite daunting. So that was probably the biggest challenge to kind of get my head around in terms of the whole thing.
Most of your peers, had they been to university first? Were you the only one who hadn't been to university, or was it an even split of people that were 18 and people that were 21, 22 and had that experience of living away from home?
So we had a real mix. My friendship group at the time, many of whom are still really good friends of mine, were a real mix of 18, 19-year-olds who hadn't been to uni but had perhaps had a year out to go and work or travel or whatever, and 21, 22-year-olds who just left uni. But actually across the course, it was such an incredible range. We had people who'd been leaving the Air Force, who were in their early 30s. We had one chap who had come to us in his early 40s, and he'd been, I think, a city banker, and he decided he wanted a career change. And, 15 years down the line is having an absolute ball. Still in aviation, still loves it. So it was a real mix of people. Certainly no specific type or background or anything, I don't think.
Tell us about any challenges that you faced during your flying training and how you overcame them.
There were many challenges. I think one that I remember specifically, which I was a bit concerned was a perception thing at the time, was one of the first instructors I got given when I was out in the States he was a British chap actually. He'd been out there for quite some time though, family out in the States, he moved over when he was young. And we were paired up as a two of students with him as an instructor. So one of you would fly, the other one would backseat, and then you'd swap over. And the chap that I was paired with, he had been an engineer beforehand, so he'd had another career and then he'd come to flying in his sort of late 20s. But he'd been an aviation engineer, so he could talk about the technical aspects of aircraft and aviation till the cows came home. And that wasn't and has never been my thing. I understand enough to get by, but I'm not massively into the tech aspects of the job. And every time we had a debrief, this particular instructor would talk to my mate and wouldn't really have anything to say to me. There was never any debrief points, which wasn't in itself a good thing, because there was never any development points. There was never anything really that he was directing to me. It was like if we had somebody else sitting next to us and I was just talking to you. I felt completely sidelined. And it was a real challenge to have to ascertain whether that was my perception because they just had more in common, or whether he genuinely wasn't talking to me, because I felt very much like I was just a spare part. I wasn't really learning anything because he was just ignoring me the whole time. And in the end, I spoke to the chief flying instructor of the school and just said, look, this is how I'm feeling. I don't know if I'm right. He went and spoke to the particular instructor, and he was very candid, actually. He was very honest, and he said, I've never taught a female student before. I've been teaching for 20 years. I've never taught a female student before, and I don't know how to deal with it.
Oh, I see.
Which was fascinating, because I'm just a person, just talk to me. And I've been really lucky, because that's one of the only times in the industry where I've ever experienced any form of sexism, really. But it was really hard as a very, very new student to understand whether it was just me being overly sensitive because I was in a stressful environment, or genuinely an issue.
So that's a really interesting story then to hear about that instructor, because it wasn't actually, well, it's very easy for you to assume that maybe just because you didn't gel or there was some kind of problem there, but really it was just him not having the skills and the tools and knowing how to teach a female.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he was a lovely chap otherwise. And to give him his dues, he did apologise for how he'd made me feel, because he genuinely hadn't realised. But he felt uncomfortable himself. I think the difference being he was, if you like, he was a proper grown-up in a role where he had the resource to go and ask, whereas I was kind of 18 and slightly terrified by the prospect of learning all of these new things. But it did take that conversation for him to recognise that there was perhaps some learning on his part as well.
I'm just thinking this is probably very applicable in the wider context as well in many organisations. What kind of skills do you think that people can equip themselves with in that situation, or maybe something similar in other industry?
So I've seen it in other parts of aviation as well, but one of the biggest things I've found is inclusivity of language. And it's not, I know this comes up an awful lot in wider society at the moment, and it doesn't have to be anything difficult. But when you read a manual and all it refers to is pilots equal he, it's very easy to switch off. So yeah, having a gender neutral uniform policy is a great theoretical step, but if all you're doing is offering men's clothing to women and not offering those smaller sizes, you're not actually becoming inclusive. So how can you solve that problem realistically? By involving those stakeholders who are affected in the discussion, making sure that your female pilots, your female students have a say in terms of how a policy is being developed, how that writing makes them feel. It doesn't exclude other people. I've had this discussion at various airlines and with various flying clubs. If you change the word he to they, who is going to feel upset by that? I'm not suggesting we make it she, because that goes the other way, of course. But there are so many easy ways to make people feel more included in the discussion. And it amazes me that we still have these conversations so far down the line. It's been 50 plus years since women were really included in the aviation world and given the opportunity to fly. But there are still so many challenges in terms of making it a more equitable platform.
Absolutely. So we'll go on to diversity a little bit later on, because I'm really interested to talk about that, particularly with regards to the charity. But just go back to your flying training in terms of overcoming any failures. Were there any times when you had to overcome a failure or where something didn't quite go to plan that you can maybe share with us?
So there weren't any major setbacks during the flying training itself. I think the biggest challenge I had was coming out of flying training and the kind of the economic environment at the time. It was early 2009, so we just had a huge economic crash, and nobody was really recruiting. So the biggest challenge I had at that time was finding the resilience to kind of keep going, to maintain that passion for aviation while still understanding that I needed to do something to bring some money in to pay the bills. And it took me 6 years to get a job, my first aviation job, and that was probably the biggest challenge for me.
So what were you doing in the meantime then in those 6 years?
So I fell into teaching. I'd done a flight instructor's course and picked up a few hours here and there of instructing, but it was never really enough again to pay the bills. So I, through various circuitous means, ended up as a maths teacher. I spent most of those 6 years teaching maths in post-compulsory education, so post-16 at the time, and then in primary schools.
So actually, I saw on your LinkedIn profile when I was doing a bit of research earlier, in fact, actually, Mark very kindly pointed it out, there was a bit where you mentioned where you were teaching to autistic boys maths.
Yes.
So how did you find having to adapt your style to their needs? And perhaps we can talk a bit about how we can include, disabled people in education and adapt what we do to meet their needs so that they are included.
So it was really difficult to start with because my background wasn't in SEN at all. As I say, trained as a flight instructor, and understandably that's not particularly something that's covered at the time. So a lot of my experience there was picked up through picked up through working in an FE college, dealing with specifically SEN and really quite high needs classes, and understanding from their normal teachers and their assistants and stuff how they needed to be dealt with. When I was working in the primary school, obviously these two individuals were in a mainstream primary school, so they were reasonably high functioning. But everything had to be adapted, and it was quite an interesting one. They were very, very competent, very bright lads, but their attention span was quite limited. And they had areas of specific interest. So I found the best way to structure a lesson was to say, okay, we've got an hour. What we're going to do is we're going to do 20 minutes of maths, and then you can have 5 minutes of playing games. And they'd go on the computer and they'd play a game for 5 minutes. And it was absolutely structured. And then we're going to do 20 minutes and we're going to do 5. But if you don't behave in this 20 minutes, that first 5 minutes goes. We're not playing that game. And having the expectations laid out really clearly tended to work. Not always, because, they were also 9, 10-year-olds. And as with any 9, 10-year-olds, sometimes they just weren't up for behaving. But being able to be really clear about the expectations and the consequences was generally enough to enable them to focus. And they did enjoy, they did enjoy the math. They did enjoy the challenge because they were pushed quite hard in that sense. And by knowing what was coming next and by understanding the expectations, they generally engaged pretty well. I also knew that I had a fantastic team behind me of the rest of the staff. So if there were any genuine problems, and it probably only happened once or twice, where one of the individuals really wasn't behaving, actually removing them from that setting and just focusing on the other was enough to keep things generally on rails. And that I think it doesn't just apply to people who are neurodiverse at all, but setting expectations makes such a difference for people in an educational setting, whether that is learning to fly, whether that is school or whatever. People understanding what's expected of them just makes everything more comfortable. I would rather go into a training day where I know what's expected of me, where I know, okay, well, we're going to have a break about 1 o'clock, because at least then you can kind of mentally plan your day and think through what's required, even if it's just, okay, I need to send a load of emails, I'll do it at 1 o'clock. It applies to everybody.
And also it's about adapting the support that you're giving them. It's sort of equity versus equality.
Yeah, and sometimes there is only so much you can do in certain settings. So the year after I taught them, I taught 4 individuals, 2 of whom had specific educational needs. And sometimes with a slightly bigger group, it wasn't always possible to fully meet everybody's needs at all times. And understanding that as long as you're doing the best that you can in that environment, actually, what else can you do?
And also, when you're a qualified flying instructor, talk to me a little bit about what you think makes a good teacher.
So, of course, flight instructing is very different to dealing with a group of sort of 30 individuals in a classroom. Everything is so much more personalised. So the qualities of a good teacher on a one-on-one basis versus a good teacher in a group setting are a little bit different, I think. You can absolutely adapt your teaching style to one individual, but there is no way to adapt your teaching style to 30 individuals. But the things that I think persist through both of those, clear communication, enabling open channels of communication such that if people genuinely don't understand, they are able to speak up. And that, again, that persists through your everyday working environment, that people need to feel empowered to be able to speak up and to ask questions if they're not sure, because it makes such a difference to safety in our world as well. They are probably the biggest factors, I think. But also having a passion for what you're doing. There is nothing worse than somebody teaching a subject or a specific skill or whatever who doesn't love what they're teaching, who doesn't enjoy it themselves, because how do you pass on that passion to somebody else if you're disengaged yourself?